Have you ever felt like you were being watched in the dark? Something barely visible, hiding around the corner, ready to pounce at the most unexpected moment? If so, welcome. Here we collect the darkest stories that seem to creep into your mind and stay there for a long time. We want to hear your emotions, your guesses, and of course your opinion. They are important to us. Leave comments under the video. Your feedback can become a part of this gloomy atmosphere, because everyone sees fear differently. Don't forget to subscribe to dive into new mysteries and darkness with us. Thank you and enjoy. When Thomas and Rebecca Harper bought a house on the outskirts of Elm Creek Township, they were overjoyed. Even the original buyers were surprised by the low price for such a home in such an area. After signing all the papers and receiving the keys to the house, the Harpers enjoyed their new home. Their two children, 8-year-old Liam and 5-year-old Emma, enjoyed the spaciousness of their new home. The house backed up to a wooded area, and the children often played at the edge of the woods, running through the lush grass and collecting leaves. The perfect family happiness lasted until the day Liam started talking about his new friends. One evening, as Rebecca was preparing dinner, Liam approached her with a straight face. "Mom, my friend said to watch out. They don't want you out in the woods at night." Rebecca laughed and stroked her son's head, dismissing his words as a mere childish fantasy. But deep inside she was uneasy. Since then, Liam and Emma had been spending more and more time outside, and when they returned to the house, they acted strangely. They were silent, looked at their parents distantly as if studying them, and spoke to each other in whispers in a language Rebecca had never heard before. A week after that conversation, Rebecca noticed that the children started playing at night. It started with soft footsteps in the hallway. She would get up in the middle of the night to check on the children, but she couldn't find them in their beds. Liam and Emma would go back to their place by morning as if nothing had happened. Thomas, though concerned, wrote it off as childish games, but Rebecca felt there was more to it than that. It was as if there was something dark behind the games. One night, Rebecca decided to follow the kids. She heard Liam whisper something to his sister and they left the house together. She slipped silently in their direction, stopped at the door, and watched breathlessly. The children walked toward the forest without looking back. They walked confidently, as if someone were holding their hand. Rebecca wanted to call out to them, but something in her gut seemed to stop her. She was paralyzed by a fear that came out of nowhere. The next morning she couldn't stand it anymore and asked Liam, "Where are you and Emma going at night?" Liam looked at her with his big eyes, which didn't have the usual childlike liveliness. They were too quiet. "To our friends. They call us. They like to play with us." "And who are these friends?" Rebecca held back the tremor in her voice. "You don't know them," Liam replied as if it were the most obvious fact. "But they know you." From that moment on, something inexplicable began to happen in the house. The lights in the rooms began to flicker, doors closed by themselves, and strange sounds came from the woods, like someone whispering among the trees. Rebecca sensed that these sounds were more than just the wind. It was as if they were calling to her children, and the call was insistent, as if invisible creatures were trying to break through. Thomas remained skeptical. He tried to explain everything rationally. The children could have heard something from the neighborhood kids or made up invisible friends. But one day, when he came home from work late at night, he saw them. Liam and Emma were standing in front of the house, gazing into the woods. He stepped closer and felt a shiver run down his spine. "Hey, what are you doing here?" he asked, trying to sound stern. Liam and Emma turned to him at the same time, their faces blank, emotionless. "We're waiting for our friends. They'll be here." Thomas laughed, thinking it was another joke, but a moment later, a silhouette emerged from the darkness between the trees. It was something tall and thin, with a vague outline, like a shadow that could be everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Thomas took a step back, but the children didn't move. "This is our new friend," Daddy, Emma said with a light, childish laugh that now sounded unsettling and out of place. Thomas tried to take the children's hands and lead them into the house, but when he touched Liam, his hands suddenly stiffened. The cold seeped into his bones, and for a moment he lost control of his actions. Liam turned his head to him and whispered, "You don't understand. They're out to get us." The next few days were a nightmare for Rebecca. The kids became completely different. They stopped talking to their parents and spent more and more time in their rooms or outside. They stopped watching cartoons and playing regular games. One day, Rebecca found them sitting in a circle on the floor, surrounded by strange drawings they had made with chalk. The drawings were terrifying human-like figures with long arms and empty eyes surrounded the children. "These are our new friends," Emma whispered. "They came from the forest. They will be with us forever." Rebecca tried to find an explanation, went to psychologists, but no one could explain what was happening. Thomas began spending more time away from home, leaving for work earlier and returning later, as if to avoid confronting reality. One night, while Thomas was at work, Rebecca heard footsteps in the house again. They were loud and clear, but when she came out of the bedroom, she saw the children standing at the door, looking out into the woods. Their eyes glowed like animals in the darkness. Rebecca couldn't stand it anymore. She grabbed the children by the hands and dragged them back into the house, but they resisted with inhuman strength. Liam looked at her and said quietly, "We have to go. Our friends want us to play with them. You can't stop us." And so, that night, Rebecca heard someone outside call her name. The voice was muffled, as if it came from underground. When my husband John and I decided to move to a small house a few miles from the nearest town, I never imagined how it would turn out, and the horror my family would endure. The house was in the shade of a thick forest, quiet, hidden from prying eyes, and seemed like the perfect place for our family. John and I wanted to get out of the city, away from the noisy world, away from the constant stress, and find peace. For our children, Lizzie and little Tom, we dreamed of a childhood spent in nature, in a simple and safe world. But within a week of moving in, I began to feel anxiety. It was implicit, slowly building up, like a lump in my throat that I could not swallow. It started with small things, strange noises at night that John blamed on animals, tools missing from the shed that he said he'd moved himself. But I knew it was something else. Something was wrong. The first real oddity was the smell. The kids and I were playing in the yard when I smelled a pungent, metallic odor coming from the woods. I looked around, but didn't see anything suspicious. John said it was probably just rain gathering the air before a storm sometimes smells like that. But by nightfall, the smell had gotten stronger. It wafted through the closed windows, leaving the room with a cold sense of impending disaster. The first night I realized things had gotten really scary was when I woke up to a loud banging. I rushed to the window and looked out into the dark shadows of the forest. At first I saw nothing, but then something flickered between the trees. A tall silhouette, barely visible in the darkness, stood motionless. I clenched my hand on the ledge, feeling the cold sweat run down my back. My husband wasn't there, he was downstairs, checking the doors. Someone was in the woods, I whispered when he returned. He dismissed it as a dream, but I could see the look in his eyes. He wasn't so sure himself. The next day, John went into the woods to see if there were any signs of intruders. He found nothing but some broken branches. But during the night there was another rattle, and again a silhouette flashed in front of my eyes. We decided to lock the house. I prayed that this intruder, whoever he was, would leave us alone. But in the night we were awakened by a scream. Lizzie was standing at the door of her room, her eyes filled with terror. Someone was banging on her window. We found no sign of them. John went through the house with a flashlight, but he didn't see anything suspicious. Then our dog, Buck, disappeared. His crate was empty and there were just deep scratches on the floor. Day 3. Late night. I didn't sleep much. The kids and I were in a locked house. John kept going from room to room, checking windows and doors. We were cut off from the outside world. There was no phone communication, was often lost in this area. We didn't have a car to leave. And where would we go? We didn't know who this man was, why he had come, what he wanted. At night we heard a rumble. There was the sound of breaking glass, and then I heard Lizzie scream again. This time I jumped out of bed and ran to her room, but the door was already open. Lizzie was standing in the corner, shaking with fear, and there were shards of glass on the floor. Someone was trying to get in. John grabbed the shotgun, but there was no sign of the man, only dark footprints leading into the woods. Day 4, an hour before dawn. I couldn't stand the nightmare anymore. It seemed that our adversary was playing with us, making us lose our heads. Tom and Lizzie's screams mingled with my heartbeat. This unknown psychopath seemed to take pleasure in our suffering. We couldn't understand his motives, but one thing was clear: he wouldn't leave until we were broken. That night, John decided to stay on duty until dawn. He sat in the living room with the shotgun in his hands. I sat next to him, trying to keep the kids calm. Suddenly, everything around us went silent. We froze, and into that dead silence came a faint tapping on the glass. A slow, methodical tapping. A tapping that came from the kitchen. I turned my head slowly, and something chilled in my veins. Someone was looking into the kitchen window. The eyes were fixed, merciless. They were watching us. I screamed and John rushed over, but when he ran outside, no one was there. The only marks on the window were bloodstains. Shadows outside the window. When I sold my flat in the city, I was 39 and thought I had made the right move. Financial problems had been piling up for several years and city life had become unaffordable. The noisy streets, the constant flow of people, the never-ending rush, it all put me under pressure and made every day a struggle for survival. I wanted to escape, to start afresh, so I moved to the countryside, away from civilization. I needed a home where no one would ask for utility payments or ask questions about overdue bills. The little house was a few miles from the nearest village, on the edge of a forest. Its windows looked out over endless fields with dense forests beyond. There was no communication with the outside world. Even the mobile phone only occasionally picked up a signal, and then only at higher altitudes. It seemed like the perfect place to start a new life. The first few weeks were quiet. I enjoyed chopping wood for the fireplace, repairing the old roof, and enjoying the silence. Each night I fell asleep to the whisper of the wind, thinking I had finally found peace. But peace proved to be an illusion. At first, everything was insignificant, almost fleeting. I came home after a long day's gardening and noticed that the door to the attic was slightly ajar. I distinctly remembered locking it, or so it seemed to me. I put it down to tiredness and didn't think much of it until I woke up that night to a strange noise. It wasn't the creaking of floorboards like in old houses, or the moaning of the wind outside the window. The sound was like a soft rustle, as if someone, not wanting to be seen, was sliding along the walls. I got out of bed carefully, trying not to make any noise, and picked up the lantern. The flickering light illuminated the corridor and I walked slowly to the stairs leading to the attic. It was empty. But when I returned, the window in the living room was ajar. I was sure I had closed it. All the next day I had the feeling that someone was watching me. I went out into the yard, looked around, even walked a couple of miles to the nearest road. Nothing, just the woods. The second night I woke up to a loud bang. It was coming from behind the basement door. The door was locked, but the sound kept coming, as if someone was banging on it from the other side. I went down, torch in hand, and stopped at the door. The noises had stopped. The hand on the lock was shaking. I opened the door and, shining the light into the depths of the cellar, saw nothing but old things covered in dust. But there was a strange coldness in the air. I noticed footprints on the floor, small patches of dirt leading from one corner to another, as if someone had been moving around the cellar. I stayed awake until morning, listening for every rustle. I knew someone was in the house, but there was no proof. It drove me mad. The third night I decided to lock all the windows and doors and make sure they were locked. But as soon as the sun dipped below the horizon, the house fell into an eerie silence. My nerves were on edge. Towards midnight I heard a knocking. A soft but insistent knocking on the bedroom window. I opened my eyes, barely making out the silhouette behind the glass. Someone was standing outside, motionless. The figure was unnaturally elongated, its face obscured by shadows. I froze, afraid to move. After a few minutes, the silhouette disappeared, as if it had vanished into the night. I ran to the window but saw nothing, no footprints, no shadow. But my heart was racing and there was an ominous feeling in the air. When I went to bed, the sound was back, a slow, methodical pounding. But this time it was coming from the door. Shaking with fear, I picked up an old kitchen knife and went to the door. There was no one there. But the feeling that someone was nearby became unbearably real. I had hardly slept. My eyes were constantly peering into the darkness. Every shadow became a silhouette. Every rustle made me reach for my knife. I realized that this man, whoever he was, didn't just want to break into the house. He wanted to break me, from the inside out. The knocking grew louder in the night, and I felt something trying to force the door open. I grabbed a knife, stood at the door, and prepared myself. My heart was pounding, my blood was pounding in my ears, and my eyes were searching every inch of the darkness. Suddenly the pounding stopped, and there was dead silence. I held my breath, waiting for something else to happen. But just when I thought it was over, there was a crack of glass. I turned round and saw someone's hand through the window. I rushed back, but it was too late. The hand reached in, clinging to the edges of the broken glass. I stabbed sharply, hitting the brush. There was a strange sound, not a scream, but something that sounded like an angry hiss. The creature, whatever it was, disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. I was left standing there, covered in sweat, clutching the knife in my bloody hand. I knew this wasn't the end. He would come back. Day replaced night, but there was no peace. Every sound now seemed a threat, every shadow the embodiment of fear. I was no longer sure where reality ended and madness began. The Moore family was ordinary people who lived in a comfortable house on the outskirts of town. Father John, Mother Liz, and their two children, 5-year-old Emily and 8-year-old Thomas, were happy in their home surrounded by woods. But the tranquility of their lives began to crumble when the children started telling strange stories about nocturnal visitors. "Mummy, Daddy, my friends come to visit me at night," said Emily happily at dinner, her eyes bright with joy. "They are so kind and tell funny stories." "Friends?" John asked with a smile as he looked at his wife. "You're dreaming, baby." "No, I'm not dreaming. They are real," insisted the girl, smiling broadly. Thomas, sitting opposite, suddenly intervened. "They come to me too," he said softly, lowering his eyes. "But they are strange. I don't think they're really friends." "What do you mean, Thomas?" Liz frowned, trying to understand what her son was saying. "They're too tall. And their eyes, they glow." Liz and John exchanged quick glances but didn't pay much attention to the stories. It all seemed like normal childhood fantasies. But with each passing day, the children's stories became more insistent and detailed. At night, Liz heard more and more rustling coming from the children's rooms. She was alarmed, but each time she went into the bedroom, she only saw the children sleeping peacefully. Sometimes Liz could even feel something watching them from the darkness. She blamed herself for the ridiculous thoughts that began to pop into her head. Surely it was all a figment of her tiredness. One night, after the children had gone to bed, John stayed late at work. Liz was alone in the big, quiet house. She lay in bed and tried to sleep, but her thoughts kept returning to the children's stories. An uncomfortable feeling rose in her chest. Suddenly she heard a soft noise as if someone was moving carefully in the hallway. Liz froze. The sound grew louder. Someone or something was clearly outside the bedroom door. Gathering her breath, she got out of bed and stepped out into the dark hallway. The light from the window illuminated the room slightly, but the corridor was still ominously dark. Step by step, Liz moved forward until she reached the door to Emily's room. As she listened, she heard a soft child's laugh mixed with a strange hissing sound. Quietly, she opened the door and froze. In the corner of the room stood a tall, oddly shaped figure. It was wrapped in what looked like a long black cloak, its face hidden in shadow. Liz held her breath. Emily was sitting on the bed, looking at the stranger with a broad smile. "Emily, what the—" Liz barely whispered, but at that moment the figure turned its head towards her. Two bright, glowing eyes burst into her consciousness. They were not human eyes. Liz recoiled, gasping in horror, and rushed to her daughter. The monster, and it was definitely a monster, turned slowly, as if time was moving differently around it. Liz grabbed Emily in her arms and ran for the door. Fear pounded in her head and her legs refused to move quickly. She looked over her shoulder. The creature hadn't moved, but its gaze wouldn't let her go. Liz ran into Thomas' room and woke her son. Everything was like a nightmare. She didn't know what to tell her husband, but one thing was clear: they had to get out of this house. As they ran to the car, John was already pulling up to the house. Panicking, Liz told him what she had seen. John looked at his wife in surprise and disbelief, but seeing the look on her face and the frightened eyes of the children, he silently started the car. They drove off into the night without looking back. A few minutes after they left the house, however, Liz felt the same sensation, as if someone was watching them. She looked out the back window and went cold. The outline of a tall figure could be seen on the dark road behind the car. "John, he's after us," Liz cried, clutching her husband's arm. "What?" John turned to see the figure in the rearview mirror. He stepped on the accelerator, but the monster moved behind the car without touching the ground, its silhouette remaining unnaturally still, yet it seemed to be gliding behind them. Suddenly the headlights caught another figure like it out of the darkness, and another. They moved together like a pack of hunters stalking their prey. The children began to cry. John tried to concentrate on the road, but the monsters were getting closer. Liz realized they weren't going to get away so easily. But what did they want? Why were they following them? Soon they stopped at a motel, hoping they could hide there. But Liz knew it was just an illusion of safety. The creatures would not leave them alone. Liz stared anxiously at the dark windows of the motel while John checked in with the elderly owner. The children sat nearby, shivering with cold and fear. The sense of danger never left Liz, as if the creatures were still watching them. She knew this place could only be a temporary shelter. They couldn't hide from these nocturnal monsters. John returned with the keys and led them into the room. Making sure the doors were locked, he sank into a chair and tried to catch his breath. "Liz, what the hell is this?" he asked, running his shaking hands over his face. "Are you sure you haven't lost your mind? Because I don't know how else to explain it." "I don't know, John, but I saw it. I saw them in Emily's room. Those creatures were not a figment of my imagination. They've come for our children, and they won't stop." Suddenly the door opened abruptly and a stranger entered the room, a tall, thin man with a gray face and deep, tired eyes. Liz screamed and grabbed the children, but John held out a hand to calm her. "Calm down. This is Stephen," he said, standing up. "He's from here. I met him in the lobby and he said he knew what we were up against." Liz looked at the man in disbelief. His appearance was too sudden and suspicious, but there was something distant in his eyes, as if he'd been through something terrible. "I understand how you feel," Stephen began, his voice deep and a little husky. "These things, I've seen them before. They come after children, play with them, pretend to be their friends, and then take them away. People usually don't notice until the last moment, when it's too late." "Have you ever experienced this?" Liz whispered, feeling the cold sweat run down her back. "Yes, I have. I lost my son 5 years ago. They took him, and I couldn't save him." Stephen sighed heavily and bowed his head. "But I learned how to fight them." "How? What do we do?" John asked, beginning to show hope. Stephen sat on the edge of the bed and looked at them, as if considering whether to reveal his truth. They feed on fear, he began quietly. The more fear they see in you, the stronger they become. They can invade your thoughts, create illusions. But they can be stopped, not by force, not by weapons, but by mind. You can't let them break you. You must show them that you're not afraid of them. Only then will they retreat. Liz felt a chill creep over her. The thought that the creatures could feed on her fear only made her more terrified. Suddenly she heard something strange outside the window, a low whisper that was getting louder and louder, as if someone was speaking from several directions at once. She turned to the window, but Stephen raised his hand. "Don't look," he said grimly. "They want you to look." Liz froze. The whispering outside the window intensified, becoming a hum of voices as childlike and happy as Emily had described. "Mummy, look, we're here. Mum, come out." "Is that them?" Thomas asked, clinging to his mother's arm. "Yes," Stephen nodded, rising to his feet. "They're playing on your fears, but don't be afraid. I'll help you deal with them." Liz, John, and the children huddled closer together, trying to cope with the terror that gripped them. Stephen pulled a small pouch from his pocket, which made a slight metallic clink. "These are protective charms," he explained, handing one to each of them. "They won't get rid of the monsters, but they will help strengthen your will." As soon as they put the amulets on, Liz felt the whispering outside the window die down, although the feeling of unease remained. Stephen stood in front of them, listening intently to the silence outside the window, like a skilled hunter waiting for prey to move. "We can't stay here," he said quietly. "This motel is only a temporary shelter. They know where we are. We need to find somewhere safe." "Where?" John asked, looking tense at Liz and the children. "Where do we run to?" Stephen turned to them and said slowly, clenching his fists, "Into the forest. There's an old place where they can't catch us." Liz felt a shiver run down her spine. A forest at night? It seemed like it would only bring them closer to the horror, but they had no choice. They packed quickly, taking only the essentials. John started the car and they pulled out of the motel. Outside the windows, the trees flashed by, dark and menacing. Liz stared at their silhouettes and couldn't shake the feeling that someone else was hiding behind each one. The moon illuminated the road, creating the illusion of shadows disappearing and reappearing. Suddenly, Stephen screamed. "Stop the car." John slammed on the brakes and they came to a halt by the side of the road. "What happened?" John asked, breathing heavily. Stephen got out of the car and pointed towards the dark trees. Liz felt a shiver run down her spine. Something was moving in the shadows, elusive but sinister. The creature that had followed them all this way was much closer now. "They're here," Stephen said quietly, pulling something out of his pocket that looked like a knife made of some strange metal. "Don't move." But before they could realize what was happening, one of the monsters appeared right in front of the car. A face covered in thin skin, huge eyes glowing in the darkness, and a soft scream coming from its unnaturally open mouth made Liz shudder. Emily screamed and Thomas grabbed her arm. Stephen stepped forward and brandished the knife. The creature froze, its body shaking as if it had lost control. Stephen spoke a few words in a language Liz had never heard before, and the monster retreated a few steps and disappeared into the shadows. "Hurry up," Stephen said as he walked back to the car. "It won't be long now." John started the engine and they set off again, heading for the place Stephen had mentioned. But even though she was temporarily relieved, Liz felt that danger was still close. The night engulfed them like an endless sea of shadows. Liz squeezed John's hand nervously, and stared out of the car window at the dark silhouettes of the trees. Every moment seemed like an eternity. Every rustle of wind brought a surge of fear. They were running from creatures that even by the laws of reality shouldn't exist. But they were here, among them, and seemed to know their every move. Stephen sat in the front seat, staring silently ahead. He seemed to know exactly where they were going, but his face remained tense, as if even his confidence was not complete. "We're close," he said at last, his voice deep and grim. "The place we're heading for is an ancient shrine. Long ago it was used as a defense against creatures like those that haunt you. They won't be able to come near you there." "What shrine?" John frowned and looked at Stephen. "Is it some sort of magic or something?" "It's not exactly magic," Stephen replied, not taking his eyes off the road. "It's more like a place of power. It was created to contain those who live in the shadows. These monsters come from the dark dimensions and feed on fear and souls. But even they have their weaknesses. The sanctuary is the only place where they lose their power. But what if they follow us?" Liz looked back nervously, her eyes darting between the children sitting quietly in the back seat and the dark road beyond. They would follow, but they wouldn't be able to cross the line. Stephen tightened the amulet around his neck. "We'll make it if we don't stop." Liz felt a cold sweat break out on her forehead. It all seemed too strange, too unreal. Her mind refused to believe it was true, but her instincts were telling her otherwise. The car finally turned off the tarmac onto a narrow path that led deep into the forest. Trees covered the sky as if to swallow them up, leaving only a narrow ribbon of road ahead. Stephen told them to stop at an old stone pillar, barely visible through the thick vegetation. "It's here," he said, getting out of the car. "We'll have to walk." Liz helped John get the children out of the car. Emily and Thomas were trembling but not crying. They felt the same tension as the adults. No one spoke, but everyone knew this was their last chance. The path they followed was narrow, littered with moss and rotten branches. Tree branches hung over them, making it feel cramped. Liz tried to ignore the sounds coming from the dark depths of the forest rustling, the tapping of branches and something that sounded like soft breathing. Suddenly they came to a small clearing with an ancient stone circle in the center. Around the stones grew strange, twisted trees, their branches seeming to twist into bizarre knots. "This is it," Stephen said as he approached the circle. "We'll be safe here." Liz looked around, trying to see how the ordinary stones could protect them. But at that moment she felt a strange warmth emanating from the circle itself. She noticed the leaves of the trees begin to shiver, and the air around them became denser, as if space itself was changing. "Quick, get inside the circle," Stephen ordered. John and Liz took the children's hands and walked over to the rocks. They stood inside as Stephen told them to, but the tension wouldn't let up. It seemed that the monsters were still around, that they were watching them through the shadows of the trees. "Now listen to me carefully," Stephen said, looking at them with grim determination. "This circle is not just a defense. It is designed to give you the power to resist these creatures. But it won't be easy. You will have to face your fear. These creatures will not be able to enter the circle, but they will try to force you to leave it. Their goal is to break your spirit. What are we supposed to do?" Liz squeezed Emily's hand nervously. "Focus on the fact that they have no power over you." Stephen pulled out another amulet and held it out to Liz. "This amulet will help you not to be influenced by them. But most importantly, don't believe what you see or hear." Stephen stood beside them, preparing for what was about to happen. Suddenly, the forest around them began to change. The whispers that were barely audible before were now loud, filling the entire space around them. Liz felt something cold enter her mind, filling her with dread. Emily screamed as a large shadow stepped out of the darkness towards them. It was one of the monsters. Its eyes glowed like two phosphorescent balls and it slowly approached the circle. But it did not cross the boundary. "They can't get in," Stephen whispered. "They're trying to break you." But Liz began to see more. The shadows around her began to take the shape of familiar faces. The image of her mother, long dead, appeared before her. a woman reaching out to her, pain on her face. "Liz, come back to me." Her voice echoed. "No, it's not her." Liz screamed, clutching the amulet. She knew it was a trick. Stephen had warned her. But the creatures didn't give up. They changed the images, creating more and more illusions, trying to break her will. John saw his brother before him, killed in an accident. Thomas heard the screams of friends he had lost. The whole forest was filled with visions, each one designed to cause maximum fear. Eventually, Liz realized that the scariest thing was not what was happening outside, but what was happening inside them. These monsters were feeding on her fear. But fear isn't just an emotion. It's a power of their own making. "We have to stop them," she shouted, looking at Stephen. "But how?" Stephen seemed to have the answer. He turned to the center of the circle, to the largest stone, and raised his hands. "We must let go of fear. It is their weapon. And as long as we are afraid, they are strong. But how can we not fear them?" John shouted, looking at the monster standing just outside the circle. "They can only do what we let them do." Stephen said firmly, "Look at them. They're just shadows. Illusions. Their power is our fear." Liz closed her eyes and squeezed the hand of John and the children. She concentrated on what Stephen was telling her. She imagined her fear disappearing, the light getting brighter, warmer, and the monsters losing their power. And suddenly something changed. The air became lighter, the whispers faded, and the shadows began to dissipate. Liz opened her eyes to see the monsters slowly melting into the air, losing their shape. They were gone. Is this the end?" Liz whispered, unable to believe her eyes. "Yes," Stephen replied quietly. "You're free." As they left the circle, the forest was quiet and peaceful. Stephen exhaled slowly and turned towards them. "You are free now. These creatures will not return. You have defeated them." Liz and John looked at each other. The children were no longer crying, but their faces were still frightened. But most importantly, the darkness was gone.